Dinner had already started when Daniel said it. The plates were half empty. The sound of silverware touching porcelain came in soft, careful little notes. Emily sat across from me, cutting into her chicken without looking up much. Daniel was at the end of the table, one elbow resting near his water glass, his expression calm in that way people get when they have already decided what they're about to say. Outside, the evening in Naperville was quiet. Inside, the dining room felt ordinary enough that no one would have guessed how quickly a family dinner could turn into something else. Daniel, he dabbed the corner of his mouth with his napkin, set it down, and looked straight at me. "I think we need to talk about something." No one answered. Not because we hadn't heard him, because all at once the room had that strange stillness that comes before a sentence lands harder than it should. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "You've been living here for months now, Marcus." His tone was even, controlled, almost practical. Then he added, "And if we're being honest, you don't really pay for anything." Emily stopped moving. It was small, just a pause. But I saw it. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. Daniel went on, as if the hardest part had already passed. "You basically eat for free in my house. There are some sentences that don't need to be shouted to humiliate you. In fact, the quiet ones usually do the most damage. They settle over a table more heavily than anger ever could." For a moment, nobody moved. Emily didn't say anything, but I noticed the way she lowered her eyes. Not dramatically, not like someone choosing sides, just a quick lowering of her gaze, the kind that says a person knows they've just witnessed something they wish had never been said out loud. The refrigerator hummed softly somewhere behind us. A glass clicked against the table when Daniel reached for it. Though he didn't drink, he only held it in his hand, waiting. Maybe he expected me to argue. Maybe he expected me to remind him how long I'd been in his life. Maybe he expected anger or wounded dignity or one of those ugly family scenes people spend years pretending never happened. I gave him none of that. I folded my napkin once, carefully, neatly. Then I placed it beside my plate and stood up. No one stopped me. No one apologized. I walked out of the dining room and into the hallway, where the air felt cooler and the silence more honest. Behind me, I could still feel the weight of that sentence. In my house, not our table, not this family, his house. I stood there for a few seconds with my phone in my hand, looking at the dark reflection in the hallway mirror. At 69, you think you understand the shape of humiliation. You think you know how disappointment will sound when it finally arrives, but hearing it from someone you helped raise is its own kind of education. I unlocked my phone, scrolled once, then pressed the number. Robert Callahan answered on the second ring. "Marcus." His voice was calm, steady, exactly as I remembered it. "It's me," I said. A pause. "Then everything all right?" I looked back toward the dining room. I could still hear the faint movement of dishes, no raised voices, no one following me, just the ordinary sounds of a family continuing to sit at a table after something had already broken. "No," I said quietly. "I don't think it is." He waited. That was one of the things I had always respected about Robert. He never rushed silence. He understood that sometimes the truth needs a second to gather itself before it can be spoken. Finally, I said, "I think it's time we talked." Another brief pause. "All right," he replied. "Tomorrow." "Yes, come by the office." "I will." When the call ended, I stood in the hallway a moment longer, my hands still wrapped around the phone. Something inside me had gone very still. Not cold, not angry, just quiet in a way I recognized immediately. It was the quiet that comes before a decision. Before I go any further, let me say something quickly. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal and the quiet moments that change everything, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you've ever had someone say something at the dinner table that you never forgot, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 69 years old, and until Daniel said those words to me over dinner, I would have told you I understood exactly where I stood in his life. I would have told you that families can survive grief. That time smooths rough edges. That loyalty, once earned, stays where it belongs. I would have told you a lot of things. What I wouldn't have told you, because I didn't yet understand it myself, was that sometimes the most dangerous shift in a family doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes it happens quietly, over months, through small assumptions, private resentments, and the slow, comfortable confidence of someone who begins to believe that what they've been living with has always belonged to them. That night, standing in Daniel's hallway with Robert Callahan's number still glowing in my call log, I realized two things. First, Daniel believed every word he had just said, and second, the truth about that house was going to matter far more than he understood. Standing in Daniel's hallway that night, the quiet after our dinner table conversation felt heavier than the words themselves. You basically eat for free in my house. People imagine that moments like that appear suddenly like lightning, but the truth is, they usually grow out of years that once seemed perfectly ordinary. Daniel and I had known each other for most of his life, but I wasn't the man who had brought him into the world. I met his mother, Laura, more than 2 decades ago. At the time, I was 48 and running a small mechanical contracting business just outside Chicago. Most of my days were spent moving between job sites, fixing heating systems in office buildings, or troubleshooting machines that had stopped working at the worst possible moment. My life was stable, quiet, sometimes a little too quiet. Laura had recently moved to Naperville after a difficult divorce. She taught 3rd grade at an elementary school, not far from downtown, the kind of teacher who remembered every student's birthday and stayed after school helping kids who struggled with reading. We met at a small fundraiser. The school district hosted one spring evening. Nothing dramatic, just a community event in a gymnasium filled with folding tables and paper banners hanging from the walls. Parents talking. Teachers greeting each other, the usual noise of a local gathering. I remember noticing Laura, because she laughed easily. Not loudly, not for attention, just warmly, the way people laugh when they genuinely enjoy the company around them. She introduced herself with that same warmth. Laura. Marcus, I said. The conversation that followed was simple. Work the neighborhood the strange way Illinois weather could feel like winter and summer in the same week. But while we talked, someone else was watching from the other side of the room. Daniel. He was 8 years old then. Laura mentioned him during our conversation. My son's somewhere around here, she said with a smile, probably hiding near the snack table. A few minutes later, I saw him. He stood near the wall holding a paper cup of lemonade, studying the room the way children do when they're not sure where they belong in it. When Laura called him over, he walked slowly, eyes moving between the two of us. Daniel, this is Marcus. He didn't offer his hand, didn't smile, just nodded once quietly. Children understand more than adults give them credit for. Daniel already knew what it meant when a new man appeared beside his mother. Uncertainty makes kids careful. A few weeks later, Laura invited me to their house for dinner. Daniel was polite but distant. He answered questions with short responses and spent most of the evening pushing food around his plate while listening more than he spoke. I didn't try to force anything. Children noticed that too. Instead, I focused on the small opportunities that appear when you spend enough time in the same room as someone. One night, Laura stayed late at school preparing report cards. Daniel had a math worksheet spread across the kitchen table when I stopped by to drop something off. He stared at the page with the kind of frustration only 4th grade fractions can create. "You stuck?" I asked. He hesitated, then slid the paper across the table. "Maybe." We spent the next 20 minutes working through the problems together. I showed him a shortcut my own teacher had taught me years earlier. When he solved the last equation correctly, his expression changed just a little. Not excitement, something quieter. recognition. After that, moments like that began appearing more often. On Saturdays, I sometimes drove him to soccer practice when Laura had school events. During the drive, he talked about teammates' homework or the unfairness of coaches who insisted on extra laps after practice. Sometimes he sat silently, watching the road. Both were fine. Trust doesn't arrive all at once. It builds through repetition, through small things, helping fix a loose bicycle chain in the driveway, explaining why a car engine makes a certain noise, listening to a child explain the complicated social politics of a fourth-grade classroom. Daniel never called me Dad, and I never asked him to. What mattered more was the slow change in how he looked at me. At first it was cautious curiosity, then familiarity, eventually something that felt almost like comfort. Laura noticed it too. One evening after Daniel had gone to bed, we stood together in the kitchen while the dishwasher hummed softly beside us. "He listens to you," she said. "I just answer questions," I replied. She smiled. "You show up." That I think mattered more than anything else. Years passed the way they often do when life finds a rhythm. Daniel grew taller. His voice deepened. School projects turned into science fairs and soccer practices turned into weekend tournaments. Somewhere in the middle of all that, Laura and I stopped feeling like two separate lives intersecting. We became something steadier. One autumn evening after Daniel had gone to a friend's house, Laura and I sat on the back porch, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the trees. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said. Her tone was calm but thoughtful. I already had a sense of what she meant. Neither of us rushed the moment. When she finally spoke again, it was simply, "Do you think we're ready to make this official?" I looked toward the yard where Daniel's soccer ball still rested near the fence. "I think," I said slowly, "we already have." A few months later, Laura and I were married. Nothing extravagant, just a small ceremony with close friends and family. Daniel stood beside his mother during the photographs. Afterward, hands in his pockets, watching everything with the quiet seriousness that had always been part of him. At one point, he looked up at me, not uncertain this time, just thoughtful. And in that moment, I believed we were beginning something that would last. After Laura and I married, the three of us began settling into something that slowly started to resemble a real family. Not the kind you see in movies where everything falls into place overnight. Ours was quieter than that. Built from routines, small responsibilities, and the ordinary rhythm of people learning to live under the same roof. Daniel was entering his teenage years then, which meant our house carried the constant energy of someone discovering independence. Teenagers don't always express trust directly. More often, they test the people around them to see who will stay steady when things become difficult. Daniel was no different. There were evenings when he came home from school, irritated about something that had happened with friends. Other nights, he disappeared into his room with homework and music, playing softly behind a closed door. Laura handled most of those moments with patience. I handled them with practicality. Between the two of us, Daniel usually found his way back to the kitchen table by dinner. That table became the center of our routine. Laura believed strongly that people who live together should eat together whenever possible. Even if the meal was simple, even if someone had homework or work deadlines waiting afterward, she insisted we sit down for at least a little while. Some nights, Daniel talked non-stop about soccer practice teachers he liked or classmates he didn't understand. Other nights he barely said anything at all. But he was there. And over time, those dinners became the quiet framework of our family. As Daniel grew older, my role in his life settled into something that felt natural. When he bought his first used car during high school, we spent an entire Saturday in the driveway with the hood open while I showed him how to check the oil and recognize the warning signs of a worn belt. He complained about the grease on his hands, but he paid attention. Later that year, he asked if I could help him practice driving on the highway. We woke up early on Sunday mornings and drove along nearly empty roads outside Naperville while the sun rose slowly over the suburbs. He was nervous the first time he merged into traffic. By the third trip, he handled it easily. Moments like that don't seem important at the time, but they accumulate, and eventually they become the foundation of a relationship. By the time Daniel reached his final year of high school, most people who met us assumed we had always been family. We never corrected them. Daniel began applying to colleges across Illinois, and Laura turned the entire process into something close to a research project. Brochures covered the kitchen table. Campus visits filled our weekends. Those drives became some of the longest conversations Daniel and I ever had. Not emotional conversations, practical ones. He asked questions about work, about money, about the kinds of decisions people regret later in life. I answered as honestly as I could. When he finally chose a university, a few hours away, Laura cried on the drive home after we dropped him off. The house felt quieter after that. Not empty exactly, just different. Daniel returned during holidays and long weekends, carrying stories about professors, roommates, and the strange freedom that comes with learning how to manage your own life. Over time, he grew more confident, more certain about where he wanted to go. After graduating from college, he accepted a position in Chicago, working in regional sales. The job demanded long hours and frequent travel across the Midwest, but he seemed energized by the pace of it. Laura followed every detail of his career with quiet pride. She tried not to make a show of it, but I could see the satisfaction in the way she listened whenever Daniel talked about a new opportunity or a difficult negotiation. It wasn't long before Daniel mentioned someone new during one of his calls. "I've been seeing someone," he said casually. One evening, Laura immediately leaned forward in her chair. "What's her name?" "Emily." "And when do we get to meet Emily?" Daniel laughed, softly. "Soon." The first time Emily came to dinner, she arrived carrying a small box of pastries from a bakery in downtown Naperville. She apologized for being 5 minutes late. Laura liked her immediately. Emily had a calm presence about her, the kind that makes people feel comfortable within minutes. She spoke thoughtfully, listened carefully, and never seemed rushed to fill silence with unnecessary conversation. During dinner, she asked Laura about teaching and listened with genuine interest while Daniel described the travel schedule his job required. At one point, she turned toward me. "Daniel told me you taught him how to fix his first car." "That might be an exaggeration," I said. "Mostly, I handed him tools and told him which bolts not to strip." Daniel laughed. The sound was easy and familiar. Moments like that made the table feel full in a way that Laura loved. Over the next few years, Emily became part of the family in the same natural way Daniel once had when I first entered their lives. Holiday dinners became louder. Conversations lasted longer. Sometimes Laura would lean back in her chair after everyone finished eating and say something like, "This is exactly how I always hoped things would turn out." And for a long time, it seemed she might be right. Daniel had built a stable career. Emily fit comfortably into our routines. The house felt warm, steady, and complete in a way that made the future seem predictable. Looking back now, I realize how rare those years were. Because when life finally changes direction, it almost never announces itself in advance. At first, the shift is so small you barely notice it. A little fatigue, a cough that doesn't go away, the kind of thing you assume will pass with time. None of us understood then that those small changes were the beginning of something that would eventually alter everything about the life we had built together. At first, the change was so small, none of us treated it seriously. Laura mentioned feeling tired more often than usual. A lingering cough followed a few weeks later, the kind people blame on seasonal allergies, or a stubborn cold that refuses to leave. She brushed it off. "I'm fine," she would say, waving away concern with the same easy smile she had always used whenever someone worried about her. For a while we believed her. But the cough didn't disappear. The fatigue stayed. Eventually, the doctor recommended tests. Hospitals have a particular kind of quiet that follows you even after you leave. It settles into the car ride home, into the kitchen when you're making coffee, into the way conversations suddenly circle around small topics because no one wants to say the real fear out loud. When the diagnosis finally came, it arrived on a grey afternoon inside a small office that smelled faintly of antiseptic. Cancer. The word didn't echo the way people imagine it might. It simply settled into the room and stayed there. Laura listened carefully as the doctor explained treatment options. Then she asked the same practical question she had asked her entire life whenever something difficult appeared. What do we do next? Treatment began almost immediately. For a while, it felt like effort alone might be enough to change the outcome. Appointments filled our calendar. Daniel drove down from Chicago whenever he could. Emily often came with him, sitting beside Laura during long waiting room hours while I spoke with nurses or filled out forms. There were still good days, days when Laura insisted on cooking dinner, even though I told her she should rest, days when she laughed about how terrible hospital coffee tasted. On those days, it was easy to believe things might return to normal. But illness has a way of quietly shifting the ground beneath your life. The treatments became harder. Laura grew weaker. By the time winter arrived, the doctors had begun speaking in the careful language people use when hope is becoming limited. Laura understood long before anyone said it directly. One evening, after Daniel and Emily had left, she asked me to sit with her in the living room. The lamp beside the couch cast a warm circle of light while snow fell silently outside. I need you to promise me something, she said. Anything. If something happens to me, don't stay alone in this house. The words felt heavier than the diagnosis had. You won't be alone, I told her. She smiled gently. You know what I mean. Daniel began visiting more often during those final months. Sometimes he came alone. Sometimes Emily came with him. They tried to keep the house lively, bringing groceries, fixing small things around the yard, sitting with Laura in the afternoons when the treatments left her too exhausted to move much. One afternoon, Daniel stood beside me in the kitchen while Laura rested upstairs. You shouldn't stay here by yourself after, he began, then stopped. I'll manage, I said. He shook his head. No, you shouldn't. At the time, it sounded like concern. Laura passed away quietly early one morning before sunrise. The house felt impossibly still afterward. When someone who shaped the rhythm of your life disappears, the silence they leave behind feels larger than the rooms themselves. Every corner holds a memory. Every routine suddenly feels incomplete. The funeral came and went in a blur of quiet handshakes, soft voices, and people saying things they hoped might bring comfort. After everyone left, the house felt even larger than before. For a few weeks, I tried to continue living there alone. I made coffee in the same kitchen Laura had stood in for years. I sat at the same table we had shared for countless dinners, but the quiet never quite settled into something peaceful. Daniel noticed. A few weeks after the funeral, he called one evening. You shouldn't stay there by yourself, he said. I've lived in this house a long time, I replied. I know, but that doesn't mean you should stay alone. He explained that he and Emily had been talking. Their home on Ashwood Lane had more than enough space, a spare bedroom, a quiet neighborhood not far from where Daniel worked. At least come stay with us for a while, he said. Until things settle down. Emily agreed when we spoke later that week. We'd really like to have you here, she said gently. At the time it sounded like kindness, the kind Laura had always believed families should show each other. So I packed a few boxes. Not everything, just the essentials. Clothes, a few photographs, and some of the books Laura and I had collected over the years. The morning I left the house in Naperville, I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. The rooms were quiet, empty, in a way they had never been before. Then I locked the door and drove to Ashwood Lane. Daniel greeted me in the driveway and helped carry my bags inside. Emily had already prepared the guest room. Fresh sheets, a small lamp beside the bed, everything arranged in a way that felt thoughtful and welcoming. For the first few weeks, life there seemed almost comfortable. Dinner together in the evenings, quiet mornings with coffee. Daniel working long hours while Emily handled most things around the house. But routines have a way of revealing small changes over time. At first, they appeared as comments so casual they barely registered. A remark about grocery bills, a joke about electricity usage, little observations that seemed harmless when spoken lightly. Still, every now and then, I noticed something else. The way Daniel sometimes referred to the place, not as our home, but as his house. For the first few weeks after I moved into Daniel's house on Ashwood Lane, life settled into something that looked almost normal. Emily made an effort to make the transition easy. She showed me where everything was in the kitchen, cleared space in the hallway closet for my coats, and asked politely if I needed anything else to feel comfortable. Daniel worked long hours, but most evenings we still managed to sit down for dinner together. At first, those dinners reminded me of the ones Laura had always insisted on. 3 people, around a table. Quiet conversation, the small, ordinary rhythm of a household sharing the same space. But over time, small things began to shift. Not dramatically, just enough to make the room feel slightly different. The first change appeared in Daniel's tone. One evening, Emily mentioned that the grocery bill had been a little higher than usual. Daniel laughed and shrugged. "Well," he said, glancing toward me, "3 adults eat more than 2. The comment was casual enough that no one reacted. Emily simply nodded and changed the subject. But I noticed the way Daniel had said it, not accusing, just measuring. After that, similar remarks began appearing here and there. Nothing harsh, nothing that could easily be challenged. A joke about electricity usage after I left a light on in the hallway, a passing comment about how much coffee someone drank in the mornings. Small observations, delivered with a half smile. The kind people use when they want something to be heard without openly confronting it. I didn't respond to any of them. Partly because they seemed harmless, partly because I understood how difficult it must be to adjust to having someone else suddenly living in your home. Daniel had spent years building a life of his own, a house, a career, a marriage. Perhaps my presence simply complicated the routine he and Emily had created together. Emily, for her part, never changed. She remained polite in the same quiet way she had always been. When Daniel made those remarks, she usually redirected the conversation towards something else, work, a movie they planned to see that weekend, or news about friends. Sometimes I caught her watching the table carefully when Daniel spoke, as if she understood that certain sentences could travel further than people intended. The routines of the house continued. Daniel left early most mornings for work. Emily handled most things around the house. I kept myself busy with small projects, fixing a loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen, replacing an outdoor light fixture that had begun flickering, the sort of practical tasks I'd spent a lifetime doing. No one asked me to do those things, but I preferred staying useful. Days passed quietly like that. Then one evening, Daniel came home, later than usual, and found me in the garage tightening a bolt on the shelving unit. He leaned against the doorframe and watched for a moment. "You don't have to do that, you know," he said. "It was loose," I replied. "Still," he said, "this isn't your responsibility." His voice wasn't angry, just firm. I set the wrench down and wiped my hands with a cloth. "I know," I said. "Just keeping busy." He nodded, but didn't look entirely satisfied. Moments like that began happening more often. Subtle reminders about boundaries. Quiet clarifications about whose space belonged to whom. One afternoon, I overheard Daniel speaking on the phone in the living room while I was in the kitchen making coffee. I know he was saying, "It's temporary." There was a pause while the person on the other end spoke. "Yeah, he moved in after Mom passed, just until things settled down." I didn't step into the room. I simply stood there beside the counter for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the sound of his voice through the hallway. Temporary. The word lingered longer than the conversation. Later that evening, Emily noticed I had been quieter than usual during dinner. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. Of course, I said, and in many ways, that was still true. Nothing dramatic had happened. No arguments, no confrontations, just a slow change in atmosphere, like the pressure in a room shifting slightly before a storm arrives. The more time passed, the more I began noticing how Daniel spoke about the house itself. Not our house, never our home, always his, my house, my garage, my bills. Each word technically true, each word carrying a weight that grew a little heavier every time it was spoken. And the strange thing was Daniel didn't seem to realize he was doing it. To him, those sentences were probably just practical observations, statements about responsibility, ownership, order. But over time, those small reminders accumulate. They settle quietly into the background of daily life until one day you realize the room no longer feels the way it once did. By the time we reached that evening at the dinner table, the one where Daniel finally said out loud what he had been hinting at for months, I already understood something important. The sentence itself wasn't the beginning of the change. It was simply the first time Daniel had decided to say the quiet part out loud. And I suppose that raises a question. If someone said something like that to you at a family dinner table, would you answer right away or stay silent the way I did? Daniel looked at me across the table. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. You basically eat for free in my house. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside the plate. Then I stood up. Daniel didn't stop me. Neither did Emily. The chair slid quietly against the floor as I stepped away from the table and walked out of the dining room. The hallway felt cooler, the air heavier somehow, as if the house itself had heard the sentence and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. For a moment I simply stood there. 69 years is long enough to understand when anger will solve nothing. There are moments in life when arguing only lowers you to the level of the sentence that was spoken. This wasn't one of those moments. Instead, I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. The screen lit the hallway softly as I scrolled through my contacts. Robert Callahan. His name had been in my phone for many years. Robert wasn't just a lawyer. He had handled several legal matters for Laura and me over the course of our marriage property paperwork, a few business documents, when I retired, the kind of quiet legal details people put in place long before they expect to need them. I pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before he answered. Marcus. His voice carried the calm, steady tone of someone who had spent decades dealing with people at moments when their lives had suddenly become complicated. It's me, I said. There was a brief pause. Everything all right? I looked back toward the dining room. I could hear the faint movement of dishes. Daniel and Emily had resumed eating, as if the evening had simply continued after a small interruption. No, I said quietly. I don't think it is. Robert didn't respond immediately. One of the things I had always respected about him was his ability to let silence exist without rushing to fill it. What happened? He asked after a moment. It's not something I can explain in a sentence, I replied. All right. Another pause. Do you want to come by the office tomorrow? Yes, what time works for you? Morning will be better. 10 o'clock, that's fine. The conversation was simple, professional. The kind of exchange that carries no visible emotion, but quietly acknowledges that something important is about to be discussed. Before hanging up, Robert added one more question. Marcus, is this about the trust? I hesitated. Yes, I said. Then we should talk. When the call ended, I stood in the hallway for another few seconds, the phone still in my hand. From the dining room, I could hear Daniel speaking softly to Emily about something unrelated to what had just happened. Work, maybe, or weekend plans. The ordinary topics people return to when they want to pretend a difficult moment never occurred. I didn't return to the table. Instead, I walked slowly toward the guest room at the end of the hallway, the room Daniel and Emily had prepared for me when I first moved in. The room was tidy, simple, a bed, a dresser, a small lamp beside the nightstand. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around for a moment. It's strange how quickly a space can begin to feel temporary when someone reminds you that you don't truly belong there. For months, I had told myself Daniel's comments were harmless, adjustments, growing pains in a household, learning to accommodate one more person. But That sentence at dinner had made something very clear. Daniel didn't see me as part of the house. He saw me as a guest who had stayed longer than expected, and, perhaps, in his mind, a guest who had started costing too much. The strange thing was I wasn't angry. Not really. Anger is loud. What I felt instead was something quieter. Clarity. For years I had believed that time and shared history were enough to define the structure of a family, but families, like houses, depend on something more solid beneath them: understanding, respect, and sometimes paperwork. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The house was still quiet. Daniel had already left for work, and Emily's car was gone from the driveway. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window as I made coffee and stood for a moment looking out toward the street. Ashwood Lane was peaceful in the mornings. Tree-lined sidewalks, neighbors walking dogs. Nothing about it suggested that a sentence spoken at a dinner table the night before could quietly change the direction of several lives. I finished my coffee, set the mug in the sink, and picked up my car keys. Robert Callahan's office was about 20 minutes away. As I pulled out of the driveway, one thought stayed with me the entire drive. Daniel believed he understood the structure of his life, the house, the responsibilities, the ownership. But there was one detail he had never fully considered. And by the time Robert and I finished our conversation that morning, he was going to learn just how important that detail really was. Robert Callahan's office was exactly the way I remembered it: quiet, orderly, the kind of place where nothing moved quickly, unless it absolutely had to. The building stood just off a tree-lined street in downtown Naperville, a short walk from the courthouse. I had been there several times over the years, though never under circumstances quite like this. Robert greeted me in the reception area. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand. "Robert." He studied my face for a moment before gesturing toward his office. "Come in." His office hadn't changed much either. Dark wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with neatly arranged folders and legal books that looked as though they had been opened thousands of times over the years. Robert closed the door behind us and sat down at his desk. So he said calmly, "Tell me what happened." I explained the dinner the night before. Not dramatically, just the facts. The sentence Daniel had spoken, the silence that followed. Robert listened, without interrupting, his hands folded on the desk. When I finished, he leaned back slightly in his chair. "And this surprised you, Isha?" he asked. In a way, I admitted, but maybe it shouldn't have. Robert nodded slowly. People misunderstand situations when information is missing. He opened a drawer and removed a folder that looked familiar, very familiar. "You remember when you and Laura came in here about 6 years ago?" he asked. "I do." That meeting had been one of those quiet legal appointments couples sometimes schedule when they begin thinking seriously about the future: estate planning, documents, the kind of things people put in place long before they expect to need them. Robert opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. "This is the family trust we created for you and Laura," he said. I glanced at the pages. The language was exactly the way I remembered it: formal, precise, written with the kind of clarity lawyers prefer when they expect documents to be read years later. Robert tapped one section with his finger. "You and Laura placed the Naperville property into this trust," he said. "That's right. And after Laura passed away, you became the sole acting trustee." "Yes." Robert nodded again. "Which means you have full authority over the assets within it." The words were calm, almost casual, but they carried a weight Daniel had clearly never considered. Robert turned another page. "Now, here's the part that may be relevant to your current situation." He slid the document slightly closer to me. The paragraph was short, clear. The kind of sentence lawyers write when they want absolutely no confusion later. "According to the trust," Robert continued, "the Ashwood Lane property was also transferred into the trust 3 years ago." I looked up at him. "Yes," I said quietly. "Laura wanted to simplify everything." Robert nodded. "And since you are the acting trustee now, that means the house on Ashwood Lane is technically owned by the trust. He paused for a moment before adding the part that made the situation unusually clear. And the trustee of that trust is you. The room felt very still for a moment, not because the information was surprising. I had known the structure of the trust for years, but hearing it spoken out loud in that quiet office gave the situation a kind of clarity Daniel had never imagined. Robert closed the folder. So, when Daniel says you're living in his house, he said carefully that may not be entirely accurate. I gave a small nod. No, I replied. It isn't. Robert studied me for a moment. What would you like to do? The question hung in the room between us. There are many ways someone could answer a question like that: anger, legal action, immediate confrontation. But none of those felt necessary. I'm not interested in humiliating anyone, I said. Robert smiled slightly. That sounds like you. I just want things to be clear. He leaned forward and rested his hands on the desk. Well, he said, clarity is something the law can usually provide. We spoke for nearly another hour. Not about revenge, about structure, about how the trust was written, how the assets were organized, and what responsibilities came with being the trustee. By the time I left Robert's office, the late morning sunlight had begun warming the sidewalk outside. The town looked exactly the same as it always had. People walking past coffee shops, cars moving slowly through intersections, ordinary life continuing without any awareness that a quiet misunderstanding inside one family had just become very clear. As I walked back toward my car, one thought stayed with me. Daniel believed he understood the house he lived in, the responsibilities, the ownership. But there are moments in life when the truth behind something familiar turns out to be very different from what people assumed, and when that truth finally becomes visible, everything that follows tends to change. When I left Robert Callahan's office that morning, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no sense of victory in the air, no dramatic realization that someone had been wrong and I had been right all along. What I felt instead was something quieter, clarity. For years, Laura and I had tried to build our family around simple things: trust, patience, and the belief that time spent showing up for one another mattered more than anything written on paper. But sometimes, the quiet documents people sign, years earlier, become the only thing that can restore balance when those human understandings begin to slip. I drove back to Ashwood Lane. Slowly. The street looked the same as it always had. Neighbors walking their dogs, a gardener trimming hedges, 2 houses down, the ordinary rhythm of a neighborhood that had no idea anything had changed. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's car was already there. Emily's was, too. For a moment, I sat inside the car with the engine off, looking at the house. Daniel had always believed this place represented the life he had built for himself, his success, his independence, the stability he had worked hard to create after college. In many ways, he wasn't wrong, but ownership is a complicated thing. Sometimes the story behind a house is longer than the person currently living inside it. When I stepped inside, Emily was in the kitchen. She looked up with a small, polite smile. "Hi, Marcus." "Hello, Emily." Daniel appeared a few seconds later, coming down the hallway with his phone still in his hand. "Where'd you go this morning?" he asked casually. "I had a meeting," I said. "With who?" "With Robert Callahan." For the first time since I'd returned, Daniel's expression shifted slightly. "Our old lawyer?" "Yes." A brief silence followed. Emily looked between us but didn't say anything. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter. "What was that about?" I walked over to the table and placed a thin folder on the surface between us. "I thought it might be a good idea to review a few things," I said, calmly. Daniel opened the folder. His eyes moved across the first page quickly, then more slowly, as he continued reading. The confidence in his posture faded little by little. Emily stepped closer and looked down at the documents beside him. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Daniel looked up. "What is this?" "It's the trust Laura and I created a few years ago," I said. "I know what a trust is. he replied, his voice slightly tighter now. And then you probably noticed something interesting in those pages. His eyes returned to the document. I could see the exact moment he reached the section Robert had pointed out to me earlier. The Ashwood Lane property, transferred into the trust 3 years earlier, acting trustee, Marcus Hale. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. That means, he began. Yes, I said gently. The room was quiet, not hostile, just still. I didn't know, Daniel said. Finally, I know. Emily closed the folder softly. Laura set this up, she asked. Yes, she never mentioned it. She didn't think she needed to. Daniel rubbed a hand across his face and stared at the table. I thought, he started, then stopped. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the refrigerator. I thought I had built all of this myself, he said quietly. You did build your life, I replied. No one's taking that away from you. But the house is simply part of a larger plan Laura wanted in place for the family. He looked at me again. I shouldn't have said what I said at dinner. I didn't answer immediately. Some apologies arrive too quickly to mean much. Others come slowly, shaped by the uncomfortable realization that something important has been misunderstood. Daniel's voice was quieter when he spoke again. I was wrong. Emily reached over and placed a hand on his arm. I think we all misunderstood a few things, she said softly. The tension that had been sitting quietly inside the house for months seemed to loosen a little in that moment. Not disappear entirely, but soften. I stood up from the table and closed the folder. The trust wasn't created to prove anyone wrong, I said. It was created to protect the family Laura cared about. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand that now. And for the first time in many months, the house felt a little more like the place Laura had always hoped it would be. Later that evening, we sat down at the same dinner table again. No one mentioned the argument from the night before. Emily talked about a project she was working on. Daniel described a difficult meeting at work. The conversation moved cautiously at first, then more naturally as the minutes passed. At one point, Daniel looked up and said quietly, I'm glad you're here. It wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. And sometimes honesty is the only repair a family really needs. That night, after the dishes were done and the house had grown quiet again, I stood for a moment in the hallway outside the guest room. For the first time since Laura passed away, the silence didn't feel quite as heavy. Maybe because the truth had finally been spoken, or maybe because families like houses sometimes need a little repair work before they feel solid again. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might appreciate it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And if you've ever experienced a moment when a family misunderstanding changed everything, feel free to leave a comment and share where you're watching from. Because in the end, the most important things we leave behind aren't houses or documents or bank accounts. They're the quiet lessons about respect, patience, and the long memory of kindness. And if I learned anything from Laura after all those years together, it's this: sometimes the strongest way to hold a family together is simply to choose dignity when it would be easier to choose anger.